All right, we're going to begin. Let's situate ourselves, and I expect that we're going to get people trickling in, so don't be concerned about that. Even on a Saturday, it's difficult to get to UCLA. The loop that you were looking at is taken from. The images are taken from the collections at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. And they're extensive collections of La Raza, Chicano Student News, Oscar Castillo's photographic collection, and of course, our very own Castro papers. And the Chicano Studies Research Center is a place where I used to work before I retired. But it's a place that draws us back, and there are many of us that come back and do work at the center, contribute to the center in whatever way we can. And my previous position allowed me to have what we call the Latino Education Summits. And I was the coordinator of those summits that ran for 10 years. But there's a young woman here today who was a graduate student at the time and who provided the co-coordinator position for that. She's gone on to her academic career and is now an associate professor at Cal State University Long Beach. Professor Lindsay Perez-Huber is sitting over here to the left. So, we also had several other conferences here at the center, one on the Sleepy Lagoon case, and a second one on the Mendez case, the school desegregation case of 1947. And once again, we had a graduate student involved in that program as a co-coordinator. And she is now a faculty member at East Los Angeles College, Professor Nadine Bermudez. She hasn't arrived yet, but the trek from East L.A. to here is pretty long. You'll see her in a bit. Today we have a conference, the 1968 Walkouts, and this is on the Chicana and Chicano student walkouts that made history of 1968. And it's our commemoration of what occurred 50 years ago. But there are other programs that have been ongoing. Cal State Los Angeles had a significant series of events and programs on their campus that included LA Unified School District students going to Cal State to commemorate the walkouts of 1968. LA Unified School District had a series of programs. They were including the walkouts in their curriculum, and that's quite significant. But of course, that's thanks to Monica Garcia and her good work on the school district board. We've also had programs at other campuses. Professor Mario Garcia spoke at Dominguez just yesterday. So you'll see different programs occurring, and Mario also had a program at Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara. So you'll see different programs occurring to commemorate this very important and significant event in the history of Chicana and Chicano peoples. Now, my thanks go today to the co-coordinator of this conference, and that would be another graduate student, also from the Graduate School of Education, and that's Bryant Partida. And Bryant's around here somewhere. He's running around, there he is down at the bottom, toward the front. Thank you, Bryant. And we also had the assistance of Johnny Ramirez, who's standing at the back like a vato that he is. He's over there in the back, and and Johnny is also from the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. I have a preference for graduate students from education. My PhD is from UCLA's Graduate School of Education. And that is one reason why we've had, for the many years that I was associated with the center, programs and events that relate to education. And today's is quite significant in regards to Chicana and Chicano education. For those of you in attendance today, you'll have a program that is quite wealthy in terms of information. It provides you access to not only the schedule of presenters, but also to an essay that we're incorporating into the program. It's quite unusual to do that, but we're including an essay written by Professor Mario Garcia that really provides a serious overview of the 1968 walkouts from the vantage point of interviewing Sal Castro, talking to Sal Castro over at least 35 hours of interview time, and also provides you with something that you can take home today. We're hoping to, with the co-editing chores completed by Professor Lindsay Perez Huber and myself, we're hoping to have a publication out at the end of this year also to commemorate the walkouts. So the continuing commemoration of the walkouts into 2018 will continue. We have a program tomorrow that'll be the screening of the two films. One is the 1996 documentary, PBS documentary, that was produced by Susan Racho. Susan Racho was at that, in the 68, a student here at UCLA, a member of UMAS. We have in the later part of tomorrow the screening of the HBO film from 2006, produced by Moctesuma Esparza, who was in 1968 a member of UCLA's UMAS. So you see the connection. There is a direct connection between UCLA UMAS, and the walkouts that occurred in East L.A. high schools. And I want to make sure that you understand that, and you take that home with you. You take that message, that important message home with you. Today, we'll have speakers that were high school students in 1968 speaking. We'll have UMAS members from the college university level speaking. They were considered outside agitators, and that's the way the news media gave coverage to them. And there are scholars who have conducted research on the Chicana and Chicano student movement and on the role of Chicanas in the 1968 walkouts. You'll have presentations on that. We also have several speakers who will comment on Sal Castro's legacy, including the continuing Chicano Youth Leadership Conference. That conference has continued since 1968. That conference produced several of the leaders of the walkouts of 1968. Without CYLC, we probably would not have had the walkouts. Huh? And that conference continues. That conference continues. And close to 15 years ago, Sal Castro asked me to participate in that conference. And how could you say no to Sal Castro? So I have been participating in that conference for quite a while, and I'll continue to do so as it is maintained by the foundation, the Sal Castro Foundation. Now, it was 2006, 2004 I interviewed Sal Castro, and in 2006 we had a conference here at UCLA called Sal Castro and the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference, the development of Chicano leadership since 1963. And that was a moment in time here at this campus that allowed us to bring the Walkouts to UCLA in a very serious way. And at that time and in his writings, Sal Castro indicated how he wanted the students of 1968, the Walkout students of 1968, to be remembered. You have in your program a memo that was drawn from the Sal Castro papers in Sal Castro's handwriting. And he wanted to provide thanks to the students of East Los Angeles, March 6th, 7th, and 8th, 1968, and their courageous marches, blowouts, and struggles to better education and the lives of all of us, from a grateful Mexican community. 50 years later, we are still thanking the students of 1968 and Sal Castro. It's a defining moment in the Chicano civil rights movement. Now I'd like to ask the director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, Professor Chon Noriega, to make a few comments.
Thank you, Carlos, and good morning, and welcome to the conference. I want to just make a few remarks and to put this event into context, and then we have a little surprise at the end. Carlos will come back up here. We're not going to sing or dance or anything, so not that big a surprise. I want to start with just the fact that the walkouts really were a defining feature of the Chicano civil rights movement, and that 50 years later, I think we can appreciate the way in which they speak to the ongoing struggle for educational access and equity, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or nationality. There are vital lessons to be learned from their example and from their focus on education, as well as from the societal response, which included arresting 13 of the organizers and trying them on conspiracy charges. Their crime was, of course, to seek better education. Now, it's, as Carlos mentioned, we're going to be hearing from people who at the time were in their late teens or early 20s. And it's often a cliche to say that today's youth are tomorrow's leaders. But I think that entirely misses the point. As the walkouts made clear in 1968, and as we are seeing today in response to mass shootings at public schools, students can bring about needed change when the adults running things have failed to do their job. And of course, we're going to see later this month a kind of return of the walkout as a strategy to bring attention to things that are just not being addressed in our society. So we need change. We need to build on the gains of 1968 rather than have them taken away. On March 1st in the New York Times, there was a report that noted that we've seen an increase in the resegregation of public schools since 1968. There's also been an increase in inequality, with the top 1% of the population receiving 52% of all new income. And that disparity is directly tied to educational opportunity. Since 1968, the number of people in prison has increased sevenfold. That's 700%, while the national population has increased just 60%. Needless to say, the prison population is predominantly non-white. Now, if we turn to public education, a report released this month called Left Out finds that 69% of the students in the UC system are non-white. It's great news. While 70% of tenured faculty and campus leadership are white. There are no Latino senior leaders in the UC Office of the President that oversees the 10-campus system. There are no Latino senior leaders in the UCLA Office of the Chancellor. And here I'm talking about vice provost, vice chancellors, as well as the executive vice chancellor and the chancellor. So there's a real disparity that is quite profound in ways that were not evident 50 years ago when the Latino population was a much smaller portion of the overall population. Now, if you look at California today, Latinos make up the majority of youth in the state at 51.4%. They make up 61.6% of youth in Los Angeles County. And when you look at the LA Unified School District, it's 72.3%. Now we look at UCLA and we see that we've actually made improvements. And at the undergraduate level, that 72.3% is now 20% in terms of undergraduate students on the campus. There's a 4-to-1 drop-off, and that is the improvement. Now you look at graduate students, that drops in half to 9.4%. And when you look at faculty, such as myself and a number of the faculty that are going to be here, we're 6.6%. So you can see why today's event is personal for us at the Chicano Studies Research Center. The high school and college students who took part in the walkouts in 1968 were among those who helped establish the center the following year. Their commitment, bravery, and persistence provide a model for the future and a reminder of our shared humanity. In the last 15 years, as Carlos mentioned, we've organized a dozen major conferences and summits that have focused attention on different segments of the education pipeline and on key figures and legal precedents. We have also built up and extended the number of archival collections available through the center, with one of the emphases being on education. And as Carlos mentioned, the Sal Castro papers are a very pivotal part of that. We've also, as you see, many of the photographic images that have shown are part of a digitization project in which we've digitized 25,000 images from the La Raza magazine and newspaper. And these are now part of a show that will be going on for another year at the Autry Museum that focuses on those images. And that show will also be traveling. Before moving on, what I'd like to do now is just acknowledge and to thank all of the presenters. We have here the staff that you'll see throughout the next 2 days. And also the deans who have been supporting our efforts in education over the years, including Amy Dorr, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, and Rachel Moran, but also Thomas Saines from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, who's partnered with us in the past as well. And I would like to, in particular, acknowledge and thank the partners for this conference, which include the Institute of American Cultures, the Division of Social Sciences, the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences, Studies, I don't know how sciences got in there, and the Cesar E. Chavez Department of Chicano Studies. And I'd like to echo Carlos's words in terms of acknowledging Mario Garcia for really making the program quite unique among conference programs, which is there's a very substantial piece of scholarship in there as well. But you still have to go to the whole conference. Now, Carlos neglected to mention somebody who's really been quite pivotal to this event today and at the center. And I want to kind of correct his oversight by calling attention to Dr. Carlos Manuel Haro himself. This event today would not have been possible without his involvement, on a volunteer basis, I should add. And I say there's this irony that for somebody who retired 10 years ago, after 32 years of working at the university and 11 years as a student, I think he's been busier than ever before. I think half of the education summits were done since you retired, Carlos, or more, maybe 2/3 of them. And Carlos has really devoted himself to organizing the annual summits that we've had, the commemorative events, but it's really been his personal commitment to educational justice that has made research in this area a hallmark of what we do at the Chicano Studies Research Center. So we're not letting it go yet. I realized when he retired that while he may have been done with working and everything, his car would start magically every other day and kind of just drive off the campus. by about the third or fourth day, Carlos just decided to get in the car and follow it. We kept an office for him. So we're very grateful for that, for the car, and for Gloria for letting him get into the car. What I'd like to do is ask Carlos to come up because we're going to present something. Some of you may know Juan Gomez-Quiñones retired after 50 years at the university. And there's been events on campus to celebrate him and to acknowledge his impact on the field of Chicano history, his impact more broadly in terms of social activism. But we wanted to have a specific acknowledgement and thanks for his pioneering role as director of the Chicano Studies Research Center. He was not the first director. He started in 1974, but he was the first one, I think, to make it beyond a year, and which says something about the times, not the people who bravely stepped into these positions. He directed the center from 1974 to 1984, really laid the foundation for what it does in terms of an academic press, developing library holdings and archival holdings, and engaging in multidisciplinary research that's very strongly vested in community partnership and having a community impact. And I'll just personally, on a personal note, say that when I was appointed director in 2002, the first thing I did was to call Juan Gomez-Quiñones and meet with him, because he had been through all of the battles that I was going to be facing, and he had really, in some ways, been responsible for the vision of what the center does. The second thing I did was to hire the person that had been his assistant director, who was Carlos Haro, and who had gone off to the International Studies and Overseas Program, which is now called the International Institute. So, Juan, we have a commendation from LA County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl. I wonder if we can come up and present this to you. Carlos, you want to present this? So it's retirement, 50 years of dedicated service, educator, mentor, and activist, UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, in recognition of dedicated service to the affairs of the community and for the civic pride demonstrated by numerous contributions for the benefit of all citizens of Los Angeles County.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Chon. Thank you, the staff of Chon, and thank you, Fabio.
Now you're going to hear more from Juan in an hour, but I'll let Carlos introduce our first speaker.
In your programs, you have bios on each of the speakers, so we won't be introducing them with lengthy introductions. But before I ask Professor Mario Garcia to come up, I want to make sure that you are aware of his publication, Blowout, Castro and the Chicano Struggle for Educational Justice, 2011. It's still available. You can get it online. And in fact, it's here at our student store if you'd like to purchase it. And if you purchase it before the conference is over, I'm sure that Mario will be happy to autograph it for you. So, our second speaker this morning will be Professor Juan Gomez-Quiñones. And he has also written a publication that is ideally suited to the topic that we're dealing with today. It's called Making Aztlán, Ideology and Culture of the Chicana and Chicano Movement, 1966 to 1977. That is also available for you, and you can buy it online or buy it here at the bookstore. And if you hurry, you can get Juan's autograph as well. So these are two publications, and the reason I mention them is that they relate to what we're talking about today, the walkouts and the involvement of students in the walkouts. So let's have Professor Garcia up.
Buenos dias. Good morning. I want to thank Professor Carlos Haro, Professor Chon Noriega, and Rebecca Epstein of the Chicano Research Center for their kind invitation and support for me to participate in this historic conference. I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge Professor Juan Gomez-Quiñones' contribution to Chicano Studies and to wish him well in his well-deserved retirement. And I also want to dedicate my remarks today to the memory of Sal Castro. The year 2018 marks the 50th anniversary of the historic blowouts, or walkouts, in the East Los Angeles public schools. Thousands, anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 high school and middle school students walked out of their schools not only in East L.A. but in other parts of the school district to protest segregated and inferior education given to Chicano students and other minorities such as African Americans. It represented the largest school walkout or strike in American history. There's no question about the historical importance of the blowouts, and yet many, including Chicanos and other Latinos and Americans in general, are not aware of this major historical event. This is why it's important to bring attention to the walkouts, especially on this important anniversary. The blowouts are also synonymous with Sal Castro, the key Chicano teacher who inspired and led the students to take this courageous action. It was and is my honor and privilege to have recorded and written via oral history the testimonio of Sal Castro and his role in the blowouts. Sal's story is crucial in understanding why this momentous protest took place. My essay today is an attempt to address the key questions before us of what the impact of the walkouts were through the eyes and vision of Sal Castro. How would Sal respond to this question if he were with us today? Of course, his spirit and inspiration are with us, and we can take comfort in this. We miss Sal, especially in this age of challenge that is the Trump era, but his story tells us what is to be done. It's my belief that the blowouts would not have occurred without Sal. This does not diminish the action of the students and their leadership, but it does point out that Sal was the indispensable element. As one of the few Chicano teachers in the East L.A. schools, specifically in Lincoln High School, Sal understood very well the problems that the students faced. But more than knowing the problems, Sal reacted to them with passionate anger and outrage that his students, including all in the Eastside schools, had to face discrimination and racism that hindered their right to a good education and a pathway to college. Sal's anger is vital in propelling him to begin discussions with the students about the conditions in the schools, and more importantly, what to do about them. His own early experiences in these schools when he was a young boy in East L.A., and then his initial years as a teacher in these schools, first at Belmont and then at Lincoln, provided him with firsthand knowledge of the unacceptable conditions in the schools. These conditions, as the blowouts would call attention to, included high dropout rates, in some schools as high as 50% of students who did not graduate. It further included low reading scores, overcrowded conditions, lack of basic infrastructure such as adequate science labs and libraries. Moreover, teachers, counselors, and principals had little of any sensitivity to the ethnic and cultural background of their Chicano students. Students were punished for speaking Spanish on the school grounds, and nothing in their schools and in their curriculum addressed their history and culture. As Sal said, they were strangers in their own schools. But the biggest social sin committed by these schools, according to Sal, were the low expectations that teachers had about their students. They would walk into their classrooms filled with Chicano students and in racist fashion believe that their students could not handle a demanding education because of their mental and cultural inferiority. Sal believed that there is no greater crime than a teacher having low expectations of his or her students. Yet this was the case in these Eastside schools. As a result, these schools instead promoted vocational education for most of these students. They did so in a patronizing way, believing that they were doing the students a favor. Since most would only go on to blue-collar jobs, the teachers argued, it was good for them to learn how to do things with their hands. The boys could learn auto mechanics, and the girls could learn how to cook and sew. None of this type of curriculum prepared or encouraged most of the students to go on to college, and indeed few did. These conditions appalled Sal, who in his own classes always demanded high performances by his students. Sal, through his experiences and through his own efforts to learn Chicano history, knew very well that these conditions in the Eastside schools were not new, and that they had a long history. Since the turn of the 20th century, as thousands of Mexican working-class immigrants crossed the border in search of work in the United States, and principally in the Southwest and Southern California, the public schools appeared in the barrios. These became the infamous Mexican schools. They were segregated and inferior schools and provided only a limited education for Mexican-American children. They used early IQ testing to justify the racist practice of tracking their students to vocational education. Sal condemned these biased tests and other later assessments and called for reforms of such testings that would take into account the language and cultural background of minority students such as Chicanos. Sal's awareness of this long history of educational racism made him appreciate the deep-seated nature of the problems that still plagued the schools in the 1960s. They may no longer be called Mexican schools, but rather inner-city schools, but they were the one and the same with similar problems and results. Sal knew that it would be a huge challenge to take on the system, but to his credit and courage and commitment, he knew that it had to be done. But it was Sal's knowledge and experience in these schools that provided him with a larger picture that he could pass on to the students as they prepared to take on the schools in the blowouts. Without Sal's sense of what needed to be done and the scope of the reforms needed, I don't believe that, one, the walkouts would have occurred, and second, that they would have been successful. But Sal also instinctively knew that the struggle for the hearts and minds of the public schools, not only in East L.A. but elsewhere, had to be a permanent revolution or permanent struggle. There would never be a final victory under the prevailing system. As the ideological conduit for the socialization of young Americans, Sal knew that the schools would always be contested grounds, and he saw this even after the walkouts and to his death. He would remind us of this today, especially when the Trump administration, through the Secretary of Education, is committed to eviscerating the public school system. Sal would caution us that despite various reforms and more Chicanos and Latinos going to college, that many of the issues that the blowouts called attention to still persist, and hence new struggles, new walkouts, and blowouts are still needed. Sal would also agree, as Carlos Munoz had stated, that the blowouts inspired the urban phase of the Chicano movement of the late 60s and 1970s. Although there had always been urban movements by Mexican Americans, these in the 1960s were overshadowed by the historic farm worker struggles led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Yet as Sal pointed out, the large majority of Mexican Americans lived in the cities, and they needed to advance their issues, including that of the schools. Although urban Mexican American civil rights groups existed, including in Los Angeles, Sal became frustrated with some of their leaders who didn't seem to have the same urgency and anger as blacks, for example. Sal sensed that the older leadership did not seem to be willing to emulate blacks in the use of militant confrontational tactics to bring attention to racist conditions and to alter them. Although Sal himself chronologically belonged more to the older generation, politically he sensed the coming of a new and more challenging generation, the Chicano generation, including his own students. But he also knew that this new generation would not just spontaneously gravitate to protest politics. Hence, Sal began a process of educating and socializing this generation through his students and Chicano students in general about the nature of the school system and the specific issues that needed to be confronted. He accomplished this through two means. First, in his classes, he attempted to deal with a sense of inferiority that many of these students had. Knowing nothing about their history and make them feel that Mexicans had done nothing in American history and that they came from a dysfunctional and quote-unquote traditional culture not suited to a modern society, many of the students had negative views about themselves, their families, and their culture. But Sal, who was at heart a rebel and promoted what the movement would call cultural nationalism, understood that Mexicans came from a proud history and culture. Although courses in Chicano history were not yet available when he went to college in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he had, at the suggestion of a radical professor at Los Angeles City College, read Carrie McWilliams's classic North from Mexico, published in 1948, and the first history of Mexican Americans. From McWilliams, Sal learned of the important history of Chicanos and of their economic, political, cultural, and military contributions to the United States. Using McWilliams and researching Mexican-American history, especially in California and local libraries, Sal transformed his history and government classes, for example, at Lincoln High School, into some of the first Chicano Studies classes. By teaching his history and that of Mexico, he attempted to confront the identity crisis and sense of inferiority that too many of his students had. This pedagogy helped to empower the students and made them more aware of the problems in the schools and in society. Secondly, Sal used his participation as a counselor in what eventually became the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference, held each year at Camp Hess-Kramer in Malibu, to also educate and socialize other Mexican-American high school students who attended these leadership camps. As I note in my book, Sal unconsciously used the methods of Paulo Freire to bring about a new concientización among the conference participants that he was in charge of. In group discussions, Sal utilized a Freirean strategy to achieve a new form of consciousness. He engaged with the students about the conditions in their public schools. This was Freire's dialogue pedagogy that made the teacher into a student and the students into teachers. Together, they came to better realize the problems that they faced in the schools and that they were not alone. These students and those in Sal's classes, and indirectly other students, came to understand an important impact of the later blowouts. This had to do with a realization by the students that they were not the problem, nor were their families and culture the problem. The problem was the schools themselves. It was the legacy of the Mexican schools that deprived Chicano students of a good and challenging education that would create new opportunities for them to go to college and to advance professionally. They also learned that only they had the power to change these conditions. No one else was going to do this for them. Concientización and the continued need for students to develop an oppositional consciousness is clearly one of the results of the blowouts, and one that is still relevant today. I believe that another result of the walkouts is that they showed that in bringing about social change, you need to have organization and clear-cut goals. Even though 60s and New Left politics upheld spontaneity as relevant to the social movements of that era, the fact is that most of these movements had organization and leadership. The 1968 blowouts were not the result of spontaneity, but months of discussion, planning, and mobilization. These were not small cadres that were being organized to take on the schools, as Raul Ruiz correctly observes, but masses of students. It was mass mobilization. Sal already by 1967, both at Lincoln and at Camp Hess-Kramer, had begun to discuss with students not only the list of grievances that they had, but the idea that they might have to take what the Chicano movement would call direct action to challenge the school system. Initially, it was not clear what such an action might consist of, but there developed a consensus that the schools were not going to change by themselves. As Walkout leader Paula Crisostomo astutely notes, change was not going to come from within, it had to come from without. Students began to identify the issues, from high dropout rates to wanting a college prep curriculum and everything in between. They wanted to be treated equally with the white students in their middle-class schools. Students from the different schools began to meet each other and to discuss their common issues. They began to collectively put together a survey of their concerns, which would later be a list of over 50 demands. The rejection or disregard of their survey only furthered the political education of the students and their realization of the intransigence of the system and of how by following the rules of the system would not accomplish anything. Other strategies needed to be employed. Such strategies include students at their different campuses organizing action groups or what would later become strike committees, such as the one at Garfield High by students such as John Ortiz and Mita Cuaron. Sal also began to have regular meetings with representatives of the different schools. He further realized the importance of recruiting Chicano college students to help in organizing the high school students. he reached out to the few such students at UCLA, Cal State LA, East LA College, and Occidental College. Community newspapers such as La Raza, Inside Eastside, and most importantly, Chicano Student News, edited by Raul Ruiz, helped to publicize the student concerns and served to create an imagined community among the students at the different schools. Sal had initially hoped that just the threat of some direct action would force the school board and the different schools to pay attention to the student demands. However, it was his father, a union man in Mexico, who told Sal that the only thing that would work would be a huelga, a student strike. Sal hoped that it wouldn't come to this, but he and others helped to organize in case of the need for such action. When students at Wilson High School on March the 1st walked out in protest of the arbitrary cancellation of their school play by the principal, the strike was on, and Sal mobilized the rest of the students. The blowouts had commenced. But the lesson of this, and one of the legacies of the walkouts, is that only organized community and grassroots action can be effective in promoting grievances and of achieving results. This is still very true today, when the Trump administration has declared war on immigrants and refugees and on the social needs of working and poor Americans. We still need many blowouts today, not just with respect to the school, but to many other social issues to combat an authoritarian government that means to overthrow our democratic system. There's no question that the most immediate impact of the blowouts was the empowerment of the students who participated, and many who emerged as key leaders, such as Paula Crisostomo and others. Sal acknowledged this when I asked him the question. He said, in the end, perhaps the most powerful legacy of the blowouts has to do with the changes in the students who walked out, the walkout generation. These were the niños héroes, the child heroes of the Chicano movement. They were willing to put their careers and perhaps even their lives on the line to change the schools. They knew that these changes might not affect them, but they did this for their younger brothers and sisters. They walked out for millions of Chicano and Latino kids whom they didn't know, who in the future might inherit a better education and more educational opportunities. The walkouts proved for many of the students in 1968 to be the most profound educational experience of their lives. That action taught them about the schools and about conditions in the country as they affected Chicanos more than anything else. They also learned about themselves and how they had the power to change not only their own lives, but society as well. This interchange may well be the ultimate legacy of the blowouts. As Sal indicates, the students now recognize that they were not the problem after years of being told that if they did not succeed in school, it was because they did not have the mental ability or the desire to succeed, and that they came from families that did not support education. All of this was nonsense and racist. The walkouts have to be seen as the ultimate educational experience for the students. Not only did they learn the problems lay in the school system, but they also learned that the power and to challenge the system and bring about changes. They were the motive force of history, or at least of their history. The blowouts were an expression of people power. The students did not have wealth or political influence on their side, but they had their bodies and they put them on the line. They followed a pattern in American history where all important changes have come not from the top, but from the bottom. This was a countervailing force to the ruling class, and through these and other such struggles, Americans gained more liberties and extended democratic rights. This is still another lesson for us today, and we have to see this expression of people power in the streets in support of immigrants and refugee rights, for affordable health care for all Americans, and for continued demand for women's rights. What the students did in 1968 was a microcosm of the Chicano movement, a social movement characterized by grassroots organizing and mobilization, whether in support of the farm workers, for educational justice, for effective political representation, for gender equality, for artistic expression, and for ending the unjust war in Vietnam. You cannot bring about change if people feel bad about themselves or feel hopeless about achieving change. Individually, we might not walk out of a classroom or school, But when everyone else is doing it, this creates courage and solidarity. This is what happened that first week in March of 1968. The students, Sal's kids as he called them, empowered themselves. They were now out to change the world, Sal said after the walkouts. An expression of this empowerment is at the end of the HBO film Walkout, when the character of Paula Crisostomo, played by actress Alexa Vega, is asked after the walkouts why not much has changed. Paula looks right into the camera and with a strong voice says, well, perhaps not a lot has changed, but I've changed. This says it all. The walkout students empowered themselves, as did the Chicano generation of the movement. Nothing was ever the same again, as the movement forced many new opportunities for Chicanos and other Latinos, including laying the basis for today's unquestioned Latino political power. This sense of empowerment is one of the major legacies of the walkouts and of the Chicano movement. To be sure, the walkouts also achieved various concrete changes over time. Following the blowouts, parents and community leaders in the Educational Issues Coordinating Committee began to negotiate the student demands with the school board. Few immediate reforms followed, but if we look at the long view of history, we can trace various substantial changes that began to occur, not only in the Eastside schools, but in many other school districts where Chicanos represented a majority or significant portion of the student body. These reforms affected not only California schools, but other southwestern states, and similar protests, including walkouts, occurred following the LA blowouts. Sal believed that the following key changes can be traced to the blowouts, and I agree. The most significant concrete legacy and result of the blowouts and of the Chicano movement was the opening up of admissions into colleges and universities for Chicano students. These were not favors from above. They were the results of Chicano struggles. Students in the walkouts noted how few of them, upon graduating, went on to college. College counselors discouraged students from going to college. At best, they suggested going to trade school or a community college, but not a four-year one. Hence, one of the demands of the students was for more college prep classes and less vocational ones. They called for more college counselors. Sal noted that there were more military recruiters at the schools than college ones. And this is when the Vietnam War was raging. What did that tell you? Many of the male students not being able to get a military deferment by going on to college, very soon after graduation, or if they dropped out, were drafted by the military. I want you, Uncle Sam said. But the blowouts began to change this. The student strike took Los Angeles by surprise, as well as the surrounding universities. No one thought about Chicanos when they thought about minorities, civil rights, or race. Everything was black and white. The walkouts and the Chicano movement dispelled this false notion and brought to people's attention the conditions of Chicanos and their frustrations and anger. As a result, the schools into the 1970s began to offer more college prep classes and provide more college counselors. This led to a significant increase in Chicanos going to college, and not just community college, but four-year ones. Sal observed that in 2 years, the number of Chicano students at UCLA alone went from 200, and he said they probably counted the gardeners in that number, went from 200 to 2,000. The same was beginning to happen at other LA colleges and in other locations in California and in the Southwest and even beyond. Since the period of the blowouts and the Chicano movement, this increase in Chicano college enrollment has continued, so that today Latinos represent the largest minority ethnic group in American colleges, including both community colleges and four-year schools. Many universities, including my own, UCSB, have become Hispanic-serving institutions, as the percentage of Latino students reach 25% and more. This does not mean that all Chicanos and Latinos are going on to college from the high schools. Too many still are not, since some of the problems identified by the walkouts unfortunately still remain. Still, the picture is a far cry from what it was in 1968. In these 50 years, the number of Latino students with college degrees has soared, created an unprecedented Latino professional class. Despite the fact that there remains much class inequalities and too many Latinos are still too concentrated in low-paying jobs, nevertheless, no one can question the major increase in Latino college enrollments. This, I argue, and I'm sure Sal would agree, is the result of the blowouts and of the Chicano movement. Most of us would not have obtained our college education, including graduate education, without the movement, forcing the doors open of universities. There is a legacy and a debt there, I tell my students, that needs to be heeded, and each of us has to determine how we pay back that legacy. One of the other demands of the blowouts was for Chicano Studies, or at least that social science and humanities classes integrate some aspects of the Chicano experience. This came from Sal's influence. In his classes, as noted, he was already teaching Chicano history, but he obviously could not reach the thousands of other students, not only in Lincoln, but in the other Eastside schools. The intent was to teach the students that Chicanos had been an important part of California and American history. We are American history was one of Sal's mantra. This demand, unfortunately, has had a mixed history. Its greatest achievement has been at the college level, but not in the high school or middle schools. Almost every California campus, UC, Cal State, and community college, has either a Chicano Studies department or program or an ethnic studies one. Most of these departments came in the wake of the blowouts. Students on these campuses can take a variety of courses on the Chicano Latino experience, from history to politics to literature and more. Some major in Chicano Studies, and on some UC campuses, such as at UCSB and UCLA, they can even acquire a PhD in Chicano Studies. The greatest achievement in Chicano Studies has not been so much its institutional history, which, like my campus, has had its share of infighting and an ability to welcome differing views, but in its scholarship. The amount of knowledge concerning Chicanos that has been researched and written in the last 50 years is staggering. We now know more about this experience than ever before. At the same time, I must say that not all of this knowledge has been integrated by other scholars in American history and American studies. I know, for example, that when my colleagues in the history department discuss the Great Depression in their introduction to U.S. history classes, that they don't include the mass deportation of Mexicans in the early 1930s. I know that when they discuss the 1954 Brown case, that they do not also reference the earlier and groundbreaking 1946 Mendez case. We have produced much new knowledge in Chicano studies, but it is still relative to the large scope of American studies and not anywhere integrated in other fields. Moreover, while Chicano Studies has achieved some success at the university level, it has largely been absent in our K-12 classes. Despite it being one of the walkout demands, Chicano Studies, as far as I can determine, is either totally absent from these schools or quite limited. What Chicano Studies classes exist are usually optional classes which limit their enrollments. This past spring, I lectured at a class on Chicano history at San Marcos High in the Santa Barbara area, taught by one of my former students. It had about 30 students, but it was the only Chicano Studies class at the schools. And in talking to some of the students, I learned that in other classes, in history and literature, for example, these classes had no Chicano content. This is unacceptable in our schools, where in many cases, the majority of students are Chicanos and Latinos. They are still being denied their history and their roles in American history, just as generations before them were similarly denied. As a result, we get students who enter our university knowing almost nothing about their backgrounds. It should not take being in college to know about Chicano history. Students should know some of this before going to college. That is why I take nothing for granted in teaching my Chicano history classes. Sal himself was very disappointed that this part of the walkout demands was not being implemented. He often said that for students to succeed, they had to feel good about themselves, and this was basic psychology 101. But if they did not know their history and the cultural contribution of Chicanos, Sal said, they would probably fail or continue to have insecurities about their identity. Sal was right, and he continues to challenge us to make sure that this one demand is implemented in our schools. It is part of the blowout legacy that still needs to be fulfilled, and we should confront our school administrators and our school boards to do so for the students' sake. One of the demands and impacts of the blowouts was the need for more Chicano Latino teachers and administrators in the schools, where Chicanos and Latinos make up a large part of the student body, in some cases an overwhelming majority. This has been achieved, and we now have many such teachers, principals, counselors, and even some on our school boards. The question is whether this has made a difference. Why is this important? It's important because we need role models for our students, and teachers are good examples of role models. It should make a Chicano student feel good and even prideful that knowledge is not just the purview of white teachers, but that teachers that look like the students and with similar names are also knowledgeable and learned. I have to assume that this is the case for most students. However, as Sal also often stressed, we need to have Chicano Latino teachers and administrators who are not afraid to be, to use Sal's term, not afraid to be change makers. Teachers and principals whose first priority should be the students and their parents, and who, like Sal, will go that extra mile for their students. Teachers and administrators who will make sure that their students learn about their history and culture, and who will make sure that they go to college. You're going to college, Sal drummed this into his students, and hopefully we have such teachers today because we need them. Sal understood that it isn't enough to have brown faces in front of the classroom and in the principal's office or even on the school board, because if they're not willing to confront the system and make sure that the schools are relevant to the students, then this part of the blowout demands is useless. Sal, as I note in my book, was a subversive teacher and an educational muckraker. He believed in radical approaches to education so that the students would not just be the recipients of knowledge, but that they themselves, in Freirean terms, also became teachers and, more importantly, developed a critical conscience so that they understood how the system oppressed people and understood that they had to go out and change it. Sal didn't believe that his kids in 1968 walked out to get teachers and administrators who would just toe the line and justify the status quo. On the contrary, they wanted, and he certainly wanted, teachers with courage and commitment to be engines of change and to go out and subvert the system as he did. Teachers have to possess a commitment for change and social justice. I hope we have such teachers and administrators, but I wonder how many. And so part of the blowout legacy is to continue to make sure that we have diversity amongst our teachers and administrators, but that they be committed to being Sal's change makers. The struggle over things such as bilingual education gets back to Sal's views of Chicano teachers and administrators as change makers. Too many such teachers and administrators, in the case of bilingual education, caved in to just accepting the more restrictive applications of bilingual education, rather than fighting for the more challenging view that would deal not only with the language issues pertaining to Chicanos and Latino students, but the historical and cultural vacuum that they found themselves in the schools. This more expansive application of bilingual education that Sal supported would deal with the insecurities of identity that too many students have, and which the schools unfortunately reinforce by not addressing the history of the culture of Chicanos and other Latinos. In other words, what Sal wanted with bilingual education was not just the issue of language, but the historical and cultural content, that you had to have that also with respect to bilingual education, and that he felt this had not been done. This is again one of those legacies of the blowouts, the issue of effective bilingual education with a cultural and historical content that still needs to be achieved. A final outcome of the blowouts had to do with the community control of the schools. This was not a foreign issue, since the founding principle of American public education had been that schools would be under community control to ensure that they were relevant to the communities that they served. After all, they were public schools. Over time, in many communities, the schools more and more came under the control of large educational bureaucracies removed from parental and community influence. In the case of Mexican Americans, there had never been any community control in the first place. The early Mexican schools were totally under the auspices of Anglo administrators and school boards, and this remained the norm into the 1960s. The blowouts directly and indirectly brought back attention to the notion that the schools had to be responsive to the communities that they served, in this case, the Mexican American community. The walkouts called attention not only that the schools should reflect the history and culture of the community, but that parents and community groups should play a larger role in the running of the schools. Has this been achieved? I think Sal believed that this had been partially achieved, including the election of Latinos to the school boards, such as Vicky Castro and others, as well as more Latino teachers and administrators, although many did not live in the districts where they taught and thus removed themselves from the community. The influx of Latino immigrants into many of these districts has also impeded community control, to the extent that working immigrants have little education themselves and, more importantly, have little of any time to attend school meetings. However, Sal believed that the schools themselves needed to do more to reach out to parents, especially immigrant parents, and bring them into the discussion of school policies. He noticed that it was unrealistic for the schools to expect working-class parents, sometimes with more than one job, to attend parent-teacher meetings in the afternoon and even evenings. Hence, the schools had to adapt to these conditions. Hold the meetings after Sunday Mass, Sal said, and the parents would attend. But this would mean that teachers, the teachers' union, and administrators would have to sacrifice their weekend time to accomplish this interaction with parents. Sal was not sure that they would. Community control is part of what the walkouts were about, and it is more than likely that this is a mixed picture and still needs to be addressed. The 1968 blowouts represent a seminal moment in the history of Chicanos in the United States and in the history of the Chicano movement. Like the Mexican-American generational civil rights movement from the 1930s to the 1960s, Chicanos in the movement era recognized the importance of education for the future of Chicanos and Latinos in the United States. In the earlier period, the battle was over the improvement of the segregated Mexican schools, but more importantly, the desegregation of those schools, as highlighted by the Mendez case. Mexican Americans already knew what the Supreme Court proclaimed in the 1954 Brown case, that separate schools were inherently unequal. The Chicano movement did not focus on desegregation, since by the 1960s, the schools attended by Chicanos were no longer segregated by school board decisions, as had occurred earlier, but were now de facto segregated by demographic change with the growth of the Latino community and by white flight. Hence, the struggles over the schools, as highlighted by the blowouts, reverted back to the earlier concept of improving and reforming those schools. But improving and making reforms related not just to physical conditions, but to the very nature of the schools themselves. The fight in the schools was now over the hearts and minds of the students themselves. It had to do with making the schools culturally relevant to the students, so that they could feel that these were in fact their schools and that they were not, quote unquote, illegal aliens in them. It has to do with the community control of the schools, so that the schools will reflect community culture and values. But more than this, the struggle such as the blowouts had to do with Sal's philosophy of education. Sal understood the difference between schooling and education. Schooling had to do with the socialization of the students to the status quo and to the dominant ideology of American capitalism and liberal democracy. It had the intent of making the students accept things as they were and not question the fundamental nature of the American system. That is schooling. But education is something quite different. Sal noted that education, real education, was developing critical consciousness in the students the way he attempted to do so in his classes and at Campus Kramer, and which was reflected in the blowouts. Students had to be encouraged to ask questions about the schools, about history, about society. Why were things as they were? What were the roots of racism and class and gender exploitation? Why weren't Chicanos being encouraged to go to college? Why did Anglos dominate the American economic and political system? Why? This was education according to Sal Castro, and in order to achieve it, teachers and students had to be subversive teachers and students as he was. You had to shake the system, and you had to confront the status quo. This is what the Blowouts and Sal Castro were all about, and that is what the Blowouts and Sal are asking us to be if the true legacy of this historical event of 1968 is to be fulfilled. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.